In 1922, in a valley carved into the desert rock on the west bank of the Nile, a man knelt beside a sealed door that had not been opened in 3,000 years. He held a candle through a hole he had chipped in the plaster. The flame flickered as hot air escaped from the chamber beyond, air that had been sealed inside since the reign of the pharaohs. Behind him stood the man who had paid for this moment, a man who had spent 15 years and a fortune digging in the Egyptian sand and finding nothing. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon, owner of one of the most magnificent country houses in England, semi-invalid, compulsive gambler, and husband to the illegitimate daughter of a Rothschild banker, leaned forward and asked the question that would echo through the century. Can you see anything? And Howard Carter, the self-taught archaeologist from Kensington, who had been fired from his previous job and had nowhere else to go, replied with 3 words that changed the history of archaeology forever. Yes, wonderful things. The tomb of Tutankhamun had been found. Within 5 months, Lord Carnarvon would be dead, killed not by a pharaoh's curse, but by a mosquito bite that he nicked while shaving. The newspapers would blame ancient magic. Arthur Conan Doyle would blame elementals. And the castle that Carnarvon had left behind in Hampshire, a 200-room Gothic fantasy designed by the same architect who built the Houses of Parliament, would begin a slow descent into ruin that would take 80 years and a television show to reverse. If you have ever watched Downton Abbey, you have seen this house. You have walked through its staterooms, climbed its staircase, admired its turrets against a Hampshire sky. 282 million people across more than 200 countries have done the same. What most of them do not know is that the real story of Highclere Castle is darker, stranger, and more improbable than anything Julian Fellows ever wrote. This is the story of Highclere Castle, and like every property in this series, the beauty on the surface conceals something far darker, far stranger, and far more human than the guidebook would have you believe. The land on which Highclere stands has been inhabited for longer than England has existed as a nation. The first written records date to 749, when an Anglo-Saxon king granted the estate to the Bishops of Winchester. For the next 800 years, the bishops held it, building a medieval palace on the grounds during the 12th and 13th centuries under Bishop William of Wykeham. The estate was recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086, confirming its place among the significant landholdings of medieval Hampshire. For 8 centuries, the bishops used the property as a country palace, a retreat from the political pressures of Winchester and London. Then came the Reformation. In 1551, King Edward VI confiscated the property from the church and granted it to the Fitzwilliam family. For the next century and a quarter, Highclere passed through several owners, none of whom left a significant mark. A manor house was built in the early 17th century. Gardens were laid out. Trees were planted. But the estate remained a relatively modest Hampshire property, unremarkable in a county full of unremarkable Hampshire properties. Then, in 1679, Sir Robert Sawyer bought it. Sawyer was not modest and not unremarkable. He was the Attorney General to both Charles II and James II, a lawyer, a Member of Parliament, a former Speaker of the House of Commons, and a college friend of Samuel Pepys. He bought Highclere as a country seat and immediately began transforming it into something worthy of a man who moved in the highest circles of Restoration England. When he died in 1692, he left the estate to his only daughter, Margaret, who married Thomas Herbert, the 8th Earl of Pembroke. Their second son, Robert Sawyer Herbert, inherited Highclere, started its portrait collection, and built the garden temples that still dot the grounds. When Robert died in 1769, the estate passed to his nephew Henry Herbert, who was created Baron Porchester, and in 1793, the first Earl of Carnarvon by George III. The Herberts had arrived. They would not leave. The first Earl's most lasting contribution was not architectural, but horticultural. He commissioned Lancelot Capability Brown, the most famous landscape designer in English history to reimagine the grounds. Brown arrived in the 1770s and did what he always did. He softened the formal gardens into sweeping parkland, planted trees in carefully calculated groups, created serpentine lakes, and produced a landscape that looked entirely natural and was entirely artificial. His work at Highclere laid the foundation for the 1,000 acres of rolling parkland that surrounds the castle today, land that visitors now photograph from the same angles that the camera crews of Downton Abbey used to establish the fictional world of the Crawley family. Brown's genius was to make wealth look effortless. The hills and the trees and the lakes appear to have been arranged by God. They were arranged by a man who charged by the acre and whose clients included half the aristocracy of England. But Brown's landscape, for all its apparent naturalism, required enormous labour to create and maintain. The formal gardens that had existed before his arrival were ripped out. Trees were felled and replanted. Earth was moved on a scale that would have required dozens of labourers working for years. The village that stood near the house was relocated by the second Earl to make more room for the parkland, a practice common among the aristocracy and one that involved the displacement of families who had lived on the land for generations. Their homes were demolished, their community was erased, and in its place, Brown and his successors planted grass and trees that visitors would later describe as ancient and timeless. The second Earl continued the horticultural tradition, serving as vice president of the Royal Horticultural Society until his death in 1833. But it was the third Earl who transformed Highclere from a Georgian manor into the building that exists today. In 1838, the third Earl of Carnarvon commissioned Sir Charles Barry to completely remodel the house. Barry was not a minor architect. He was the man responsible for the new Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, the most important government building in the British Empire. He was an exponent of the Jacobean style, a Victorian revival of the English Renaissance architecture of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and he applied it to Highclere with the same ambition and the same attention to detail that he brought to the Thames. The project was enormous. The old Georgian house was encased in Bath stone, fitted with Gothic turrets and Italianate towers, and expanded to between 200 and 300 rooms. The work took nearly 40 years to complete, from 1838 to 1878, spanning the lifetimes of both the third Earl and his successor. The saloon, the great central hall of the house, was given 17th century Spanish leather wall coverings from Cordoba, purchased by the third Earl and installed in the 1860s. The music room was hung with 16th century Italian embroideries and contained a mahogany desk that had belonged to Napoleon, purchased by the Earl in 1821 after the Emperor's death. The library held more than 5,600 books, the earliest dating to the 16th century. George Gilbert Scott designed the entrance hall in the Gothic style, with slender columns of red and blue marble ascending to a domed roof. Thomas Allen designed the great oak staircase, which took the carvers at Cox and Son of London nearly a year to complete. By the time the renovations were finished, Highclere was one of the largest and most opulent country houses in England. It was also financially ruinous. The building spree had consumed a fortune, and the family that lived inside it was running out of money. What the visitors to Highclere's restored staterooms do not see, and what the architects' names and the Earl's portraits do not tell you, is who actually built and maintained this building. The construction workforce during Barry's 40-year renovation numbered in the hundreds stonecutters and masons and carpenters and plasterers whose names appear nowhere in the castle's records. The domestic staff who kept the finished house running were similarly invisible. At its Edwardian peak, Highclere employed between 60 and 150 people: footmen, housemaids, laundry maids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, a butler, a housekeeper, a cook, valets, ladies' maids, gardeners, gamekeepers, stable hands, grooms, and the vast supporting infrastructure that made aristocratic life possible. They used a separate staircase, a stone service stair behind a green baize door leading from the saloon, which took them up 3 floors to attend to the family and carry out their cleaning and domestic duties unobtrusively. The key word was unobtrusively. The entire architecture of the house was designed to ensure that the family never had to see the labour that sustained them. The servants rose before dawn, lit fires in every occupied room, prepared breakfast, laid tables, cleaned rooms that had been slept in, washed clothes, polished silver, and performed 1,000 daily tasks that were meant to appear as if they had happened by magic. In the winter months, the house consumed coal by the ton. The heating system, such as it was, could not keep 300 rooms warm, and the servants who worked in the upper floors and the basement endured temperatures that the family in the staterooms never experienced. When Almina hired beautiful nurses for her wartime hospital and instructed them to wear full makeup at all times, she was applying the same principle she had learned from running a great house. The labor must be attractive, and the effort must be invisible. The fire evacuation procedure for the upper floors tells you everything about the castle's attitude toward its staff. Canvas chutes, held up by iron rings, were installed to allow servants to slide down from the upper stories in the event of a fire. The family, on the lower floors, would use the staircases. The servants would slide down fabric tubes like parcels in a post office. Even in emergency, the distinction between those who lived upstairs and those who worked there was maintained. The 4th Earl of Carnarvon was not a builder. He was a politician, and a significant one. He served as Secretary of State for the colonies, under the Earl of Derby and later under Benjamin Disraeli, overseeing the expansion of the British Empire during one of its most aggressive periods. He was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He used the library at Highclere as a private office for meetings with his Conservative allies, and the room retains its distinctly masculine atmosphere to this day. His portrait hangs in the castle alongside Van Dyck's and Gainsborough's, and his political career connected Highclere to the highest levels of imperial power. But the 4th Earl's most consequential act was not political, it was dynastic. His first wife, Lady Evelyn Stanhope, died young, leaving him with a single son, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, born on the 26th of June 1866 at Highclere Castle. The 4th Earl's political career intersected with some of the most consequential decisions of the Victorian era. As Colonial Secretary, he was involved in the Confederation of Canada and played a role in debates over South African governance that would eventually contribute to the Boer Wars. His half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, the 5th Earl's sibling from a second marriage, would later become one of the most eccentric figures in British public life, a near-blind adventurer who was twice offered the throne of Albania and who served as the inspiration for John Buchan's novel Dorian Gray. But it was the 4th Earl's only son from his first marriage who would make the family name famous beyond anything politics could achieve. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, born on the 26th of June 1866 at Highclere Castle, would become the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. He would discover the tomb of Tutankhamun, and he would die for it. The 5th Earl was, by all accounts, a man of considerable intelligence and almost no discipline. Educated at Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, he inherited the earldom in 1890 at the age of 24 and immediately set about spending money he did not have. He was a compulsive gambler. He was an obsessive horseman who established Highclere Stud in 1902 to breed thoroughbred racehorses. He was one of the earliest and most reckless adopters of the motor car, driving at speeds that terrified his passengers and alarmed the authorities. England's speed limit at the time was 6 miles per hour. The 5th Earl went to Germany, where the limits were higher, and drove even faster. In 1901, near the spa town of Bad Schwalbach, he swerved to avoid an ox cart and crashed catastrophically. He was nearly killed. The accident left him with severe injuries, lasting lung damage, and chronic frailty that would plague him for the rest of his life. He would never fully recover. His doctors advised him to spend the winters somewhere warm, somewhere dry, somewhere that would not aggravate his damaged lungs. He chose Egypt. It was a decision that would lead to the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. But first, he needed money, and money, for the fifth Earl, came in the form of a 19-year-old woman who was 5 feet tall, devastatingly beautiful, and the illegitimate daughter of one of the richest men in Europe. His closest friend was Prince Victor Duleep Singh, the son of the last Maharaja of Lahore and godson of Queen Victoria. Victor was charming, well-connected, and by all accounts a corrupting influence on the young Earl. It was Victor who allegedly arranged a lady of the night to take Carnarvon's virginity. The two had been inseparable since their Eton days, and their friendship was the kind of aristocratic male bond that thrived on shared appetites for gambling, racing, and the kind of adventures that polite society pretended not to notice. Victor's own story was extraordinary and tragic. His father, Maharaja Duleep Singh, had been deposed by the British as a child, separated from the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond, and brought to England, where he was raised as a curiosity of empire, a living trophy dressed in English clothes and taught English manners. Victor carried this inheritance with a lightness that concealed its weight. He would later be rumoured to have fathered Almina's eldest son, Lord Porchester, though the current Earl and Countess have disputed this claim. The fifth Earl's world before Egypt was one of thoroughbreds and motor cars, of London clubs and Hampshire shooting parties, of debts accumulated with the casual confidence of a man who assumed his name would always be worth more than his bank balance. The car crash in Germany ended that world. It did not make him cautious. It made him desperate for something to fill the void that recklessness had previously occupied. Egypt was not a choice. It was a necessity. Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra Wombwell was officially the daughter of Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, a retired British Army officer and businessman, and his French wife Marie Boyer. Unofficially, everyone in London society knew the truth. Her real father was Alfred de Rothschild, the unmarried banker who was the son of Lionel de Rothschild and a member of one of the most powerful financial dynasties in European history. Alfred doted on Almina. He funded her education, her wardrobe, her debut into society. When she was 17, he presented her at Queen Victoria's court, dressed in an elaborate gown of white tulle and adorned with Rothschild jewels. She was nicknamed the Pocket Venus for her diminutive stature and striking beauty, and when the time came for her to marry, Alfred de Rothschild did what the Rothschilds had always done. He bought her the best available option. The fifth Earl of Carnarvon had a title, 4 estates, 6,000 acres of English countryside, and Highclere Castle. He also had crushing debts from gambling, horse racing, and a lifestyle that far exceeded his income. Rothschild offered to clear those debts and provide Almina with a marriage settlement of £500,000, a sum equivalent to roughly £84 million in today's money. In exchange, his illegitimate daughter would become a countess. The deal was struck. On the 26th of June, 1895, Almina Wombwell married the 5th Earl of Carnarvon at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. She entered the church as an illegitimate child with an uncertain place in society. She emerged as the 5th Countess of Carnarvon, mistress of Highclere Castle. The satirical magazine Punch would later call Lord Carnarvon Sir Lazarus Schnorrers, Almina Lady Schnorrer, and their daughter the girl who put the Lux into Luxor. The snobbery was ugly, the anti-Semitism was naked, and the underlying truth was undeniable. Without Rothschild money, Highclere would have been sold. The castle that the world now knows as Downton Abbey was saved in 1895 by the fortune of a Jewish banker who could not marry the woman he loved or publicly acknowledge the daughter he adored. The Rothschild money did more than save Highclere. It funded an obsession. After his near-fatal car crash in 1901, the fifth Earl began spending his winters in Egypt, as his doctors had advised. He arrived in Cairo as a wealthy invalid looking for something to do. He left as an amateur Egyptologist, consumed by a passion that would define and ultimately end his life. He began sponsoring archaeological digs almost immediately, starting with small excavations near Thebes. His early efforts were enthusiastic but amateurish. He needed professional help. In 1907, on the recommendation of Gaston Maspero, the Director General of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, he was introduced to Howard Carter. Carter was a remarkable figure. Born in Kensington in 1874, the son of an animal painter who worked for the Illustrated London News, he had no university education but had worked as an assistant to the famous archaeologists Flinders Petrie and Edouard Navel, eventually rising to become Inspector of Antiquities in Cairo. He had lost that position after an altercation with some French visitors, and when he met Carnarvon, he was essentially unemployed, scraping a living selling watercolours to tourists. The two men could not have been more different. Carnarvon was an Etonian earl with a Rothschild wife and a stable of racehorses. Carter was a middle-class artist's son with no degree and no patron. But Maspero saw what they had in common. Both were obsessive, both were stubborn, and both believed that the Valley of the Kings still held secrets that previous expeditions had missed. Carnarvon provided the money. Carter provided the expertise. Together, they began one of the longest and most expensive archaeological treasure hunts in history. The marriage was at its core a transaction. Almina brought money, Carnarvon brought a title. Alfred de Rothschild, who could not publicly acknowledge his daughter because of the social constraints on a Jewish banker in Victorian England, bought her the next best thing: respectability. The marriage settlement was staggering in its specificity. Rothschild agreed to transfer £500,000 to the trustees of the marriage settlement from his estate, a covenant that would today be worth approximately £84 million. In addition, he paid off Carnarvon's existing debts, provided the couple with an annual allowance, and later made Almina the heir to his entire fortune. When Rothschild threw a party at Highclere for the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, Almina spent the equivalent of £360,000 on a 3-day visit that included meals of almost obscene extravagance: consomme, grilled turbot, roast quail, foie gras, asparagus, and elaborate desserts served on gold plate to a prince whose appetite was legendary. This was what Rothschild money bought: access to royalty, the erasure of illegitimacy, and the transformation of a Hampshire country house into a venue that could compete with the grandest establishments in England. Almina, for her part, threw herself into the role of countess, with an energy that surprised everyone who had expected her to be merely decorative. She modernized Highclere, installing electricity, central heating, and new plumbing. She redecorated rooms in the latest styles. She managed a household of dozens of servants with the organizational efficiency of a military commander. And she spent money with a freedom that would have been reckless in anyone whose father was not a Rothschild. For 15 years, they dug, from 1907 to 1911, and again from 1917 after the interruption of the First World War. Carter supervised systematic excavations across the Theban necropolis. They explored the tombs of nobles at Deir el-Bahari. They published their findings in a handsome volume, 5 years' explorations at Thebes in 1912. They found artifacts, pottery fragments, ostraca bearing administrative texts, and the scattered evidence of ancient lives. But they did not find what they were looking for. They were searching for the tomb of Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh of the 18th dynasty who had died young and whose burial site had never been definitively located. In 1914, Carnarvon received the concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings itself, replacing the American excavator Theodore Davis, who had given up. Carter mapped the valley. identified areas that had never been properly cleared, and began the grinding, unglamorous work of removing thousands of tons of rubble, sand, and debris from ancient flood deposits. Season after season yielded nothing significant. The costs were enormous. Carnarvon was spending money that even a Rothschild fortune could not sustain indefinitely. By 1922, he had had enough. He summoned Carter to Highclere Castle and told him the funds had dried up. There would be no more seasons. Carter, who had devoted his entire adult life to this search, made the most important plea of his career. He begged Carnarvon for one more chance, one more season. He even offered to finance it himself. Carnarvon was so moved by Carter's commitment that he agreed to pay for one final year. The concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings had been obtained in 1914, taking over from the American excavator Theodore Davis, who had declared that the valley was exhausted and that there were no more royal tombs to be found. Carter disagreed. He had studied the evidence meticulously. Small items bearing Tutankhamun's name had been found scattered across the valley by previous expeditions, including a faience cup, a cache of embalming materials, and fragments of gold foil. Someone had been buried here. The tomb had simply never been located because it was hidden beneath the rubble and workmen's huts left behind by laborers who had built the later tomb of Ramesses VI directly above it. Carter mapped every inch of the valley and identified a triangular area of bedrock that had never been cleared to the base. He was convinced the tomb lay beneath it. The First World War interrupted the work from 1914 to 1917. When excavations resumed, Carter began the methodical clearance of his target area, season after season, removing thousands of tons of debris. By 1922, he had cleared most of the triangle, but had been forced to skip a section directly in front of the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI, because removing the rubble would have blocked tourist access to one of the valley's most popular sites. It was this final, uncleared section that he planned to excavate in his last season. Carter returned to Egypt knowing that the 1922-23 season would almost certainly be his last. The partnership between Carter and Carnarvon was an extraordinary study in complementary obsessions. Carter was meticulous, methodical, and almost pathologically patient. He could spend months clearing a single area of rubble, recording every potsherd and flint fragment with the precision of a man who understood that archaeology is not treasure hunting, but systematic destruction. Carnarvon was the opposite: impatient, impulsive, and accustomed to getting what he wanted immediately. His early solo excavations in Egypt had produced almost nothing because he lacked the technical knowledge to identify promising sites and the discipline to work them properly. His first dig, arranged through Lord Cromer, the British Consul General in Egypt, lasted 6 weeks and yielded a mummified cat. After that humiliation, he accepted that he needed a professional. Carter gave him one. In return, Carnarvon gave Carter something equally valuable: financial security and social access. The Egyptian Antiquities Service was run by Frenchmen, the British diplomatic establishment was run by old Etonians, and the Valley of the Kings was controlled by a web of concessions, permissions, and political relationships that an unemployed artist from Kensington could never navigate alone. Together, they published 5 years' explorations at Thebes in 1912, a lavishly illustrated volume that established Carnarvon as a serious collector and Carter as a world-class excavator. Lady Almina accompanied them on early expeditions, arriving in the Egyptian desert dressed as if for a Marlborough House garden party and dripping in Rothschild jewels. The contrast between her appearance and the dusty reality of archaeological fieldwork became a running joke among the excavation teams. The 1922-23 season began on the 1st of November. Carter had spent the summer in England planning the campaign with military precision. He knew exactly where to dig: the uncleared triangle of bedrock in front of the tomb of Ramesses VI, the section he had been forced to skip in previous years because clearing it would have blocked tourist access. The area was covered in workmen's huts, the remains of shelters built by labourers who had constructed Ramesses' tomb 3,000 years earlier. Beneath those huts, Carter was certain, lay the entrance to Tutankhamun's burial. He hired his workforce, set them to clearing the rubble, and waited. The team included a water boy, a young Egyptian whose job was to carry water to the labourers in the desert heat. It was this boy, on the third day of the new season, who found the first step. The detail matters because it is the invisible worker, the unnamed labourer, who made the discovery. Carter recorded the find. The water boy's name does not appear in his diary. The pattern of invisible labour that runs through every property in this series was present even at the moment of the 20th century's greatest archaeological breakthrough. Someone did the work. Someone else got the credit. On the 4th of November, 1922, 3 days into the new season, a water boy stumbled onto a step cut into the bedrock. Carter's team cleared the rubble and revealed a descending staircase leading to a sealed door. On the door was a cartouche, the royal seal of Tutankhamun. Carter sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. At last, we have made wonderful discovery in Valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon travelled to Egypt immediately, accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. They arrived at Luxor on the 23rd of November. The next day, the full extent of the stairway was cleared, and the seal on the outer doorway was confirmed. On the 26th of November, Carter made a tiny breach in the top left-hand corner of the inner doorway, inserted a candle, and peered into the darkness. The hot air that escaped from the chamber caused the flame to flicker. Then his eyes adjusted. Gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. Animal couches, chariots, statues, chests, a golden throne, alabaster vases, jeweled caskets, objects piled on top of each other in magnificent disarray. The funeral goods of a boy king undisturbed for 3,200 years. Lord Carnarvon asked his question. Carter gave his answer, and Lady Evelyn, whose presence at the discovery has been largely omitted from popular accounts, but who was photographed at the site and who was among the first to enter the tomb, stood beside them both. It was arguably the greatest archaeological discovery ever made. Carter's own account of the moment is restrained to the point of being inadequate. He described the candle flickering as the air escaped, and then, as his eyes grew accustomed to the light, the details of the room emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere the glint of gold. The antechamber alone contained more than 600 objects. Beyond it lay the burial chamber, sealed by a plastered wall decorated with painted scenes, and beyond that the treasury, guarded by a life-sized golden figure of the jackal god Anubis crouched on a shrine. The sarcophagus held 3 nested coffins, the innermost of which was solid gold and weighed over 100 kilograms. It took 8 men to lift it, and inside the innermost coffin lay the mummy of Tutankhamun, his face covered by the gold and lapis lazuli death mask that is now the most recognizable artifact in the history of archaeology. The tomb had been partially robbed in antiquity, but the robbers had been caught, and the necropolis officials had resealed the entrance and piled workmen's huts over it. For 3,000 years, nobody had known it was there. Lord Carnarvon had negotiated an exclusive deal with the Times of London for coverage of the excavation, a decision that infuriated every other newspaper in the world and created an adversarial relationship with the press that would have consequences long after his death. The Egyptian authorities, too, were unsettled by the scale of the foreign attention being directed at their national heritage. The seeds of the legal dispute that would consume the 6th Earl were planted at the moment of discovery, even as the champagne was being poured. The discovery was also the first global media event. Newspapers across the world ran the story. The public was captivated. Tatmania swept through Western culture, influencing cinema, fashion, jewellery, architecture, and the emerging Art Deco movement. And at the centre of it all was a semi semi-invalid Earl from Hampshire who had nearly been killed by a motor car and whose wife's money had made the whole thing possible. Lord Carnarvon did not live to see the most precious treasures removed from the burial chamber. In late February 1923, a rift with Carter, probably caused by disagreements over how to manage the Egyptian authorities, temporarily halted the excavation. Work resumed in early March after Carnarvon apologized. It was his last significant involvement. On the 19th of March, he was bitten by a mosquito on his cheek. While shaving, he cut the bite with his razor. The wound became infected. Erysipelas, a streptococcal infection of the skin and underlying tissue, set in rapidly. His already compromised immune system, weakened by 2 decades of chronic lung problems following the 1901 car crash, could not fight it. Pneumonia developed. His condition deteriorated over the following weeks. On the 5th of April, 1923, at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon died of multi-organ failure. He was 56 years old. The newspaper reports were immediate and sensational. It was claimed that at the moment of his death, every light in Cairo went dark. His dog, Susie, back at Highclere Castle in Hampshire, was said to have howled and died at the same hour. A cobra, the symbol of Egyptian royalty, was found to have eaten Carter's pet canary. None of these stories have been verified, but they did not need to be verified to be believed. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a committed spiritualist, arrived in New York 2 days before Carnarvon's death for a 4-month lecture tour and was immediately asked by reporters whether he connected the death to a pharaoh's curse. He did. He blamed elementals, supernatural entities created by Tutankhamun's priests to guard the royal tomb. Howard Carter, the man who had actually opened the tomb and who would live for another 16 years, dismissed all of it as Tommy Rot. A study published in the Lancet in 2003 confirmed that of the 25 Westerners who entered the tomb, Carnarvon was the only one to become ill or die soon afterwards. The curse, such as it was, had a statistical sample of 1. The death of Lord Carnarvon transformed a scientific discovery into a global sensation of an entirely different kind. Within weeks of his death, newspapers around the world were running stories about the curse of the pharaohs. Deaths that had nothing to do with the tomb were attributed to it. When Lord Carnarvon's half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, himself a remarkable figure who had been offered the throne of Albania and who was nearly blind from a hereditary condition, died later that year after a dental operation, the press linked his death to the curse. When the radiologist Archibald Douglas Reed, who had X-rayed the mummy, died of a mysterious illness in 1924, the curse was blamed again. A catalogue of loosely connected deaths was assembled and presented as evidence of supernatural retribution. The truth was more prosaic. Carter, who had spent more time in the tomb than anyone, lived until 1939 and died at the age of 64 of lymphoma, a disease that has no known connection to ancient Egyptian tombs. The other members of the excavation team lived ordinary lifespans. The curse was a media creation, fueled by the public's appetite for mystery and by Arthur Conan Doyle's credibility as both a famous author and a committed spiritualist. But the damage to the Carnarvon family was real. The curse narrative overshadowed the genuine scientific achievement that the 5th Earl had funded. His legacy became the curse, rather than the discovery, and at Highclere, his son's response was to bury the entire subject, literally hiding the evidence in cupboards and forbidding anyone to speak of it. Almina's story after Lord Carnarvon's death is one of the strangest epilogues in British aristocratic history. She remarried in December 1923, just 8 months after the Earl's death, to Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow Denistone, a man she had met through mutual friends. The marriage was complicated from the start. Denistone's ex-wife Dorothy brought a sensational court case that aired the most intimate details of all their lives in public. Almina, who had spent her entire career as Countess managing appearances, suddenly found herself at the center of a scandal that eclipsed anything the curse of Tutankhamun could offer. She used Dennistoun's bank accounts to hide money from the tax authorities. She continued to spend at a rate that even Rothschild money could not sustain indefinitely. Her nursing hospitals continued to operate after the war, treating private patients, but the costs were staggering. By the end of her life, Almina had burned through 2 fortunes, her father's and her husband's. She died on the 8th of May, 1969, at the age of 93, in an ordinary terraced house in Bristol. The Pocket Venus, the illegitimate Rothschild daughter who had entered St. Margaret's Church as a nobody and emerged as a countess who had saved Highclere with her dowry, nursed wounded soldiers with her charm, and funded the discovery of Tutankhamun with her inheritance, ended her days in a house that could have fit inside the saloon of Highclere Castle with room to spare. Lord Carnarvon was buried on Beacon Hill, an ancient Iron Age hill fort overlooking Highclere Castle. The location was appropriate for a man who had spent his life digging into the past. The grave is simple, a headstone on the grass surrounded by a fence, visible from the castle's upper windows. At the funeral, a medium is said to have approached the 6th Earl and warned him never to visit his father's grave, lest the curse pass to him. The young Earl, by some accounts, heeded the advice. What is certain is that the 6th Earl wanted nothing to do with Egypt. He was furious after losing a lawsuit in 1924 against the Egyptian government, in which he had claimed a half share of the tomb's contents. The court ruled against him. Miffed, the aristocrat forbade any mention of Egypt within the walls of Highclere. The word itself became taboo in the castle. His father's collection, one of the most extraordinary assemblages of Egyptian antiquities in private hands, was dealt with swiftly. The widow, Almina, sold the majority of the collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to pay the death duties that the 5th Earl's estate owed to the British government. Howard Carter personally catalogued the pieces for the sale, and when he was done, he noted that he had left a few unimportant items at Highclere. Those items were tucked into hidden cupboards and forgotten. The 6th Earl's life was turbulent in ways that had nothing to do with ancient curses. He married twice. His first wife was Anne Catherine Tredick Wendell, an American with whom he had a son who became the 7th Earl, and a daughter. The marriage ended in divorce in 1936. His second wife was the Austrian actress and dancer Tilly Losch, an exotic and difficult woman whose presence at Highclere must have been startling for the Hampshire gentry. That marriage also ended in divorce. The pattern was clear. The Carnarvon men were drawn to women who were, in one way or another, outsiders. Almina, the illegitimate Rothschild; Tilly, the Viennese dancer; the American mother of the 7th Earl's heir. The Egyptian fortune that Almina had brought to the family was largely spent. The castle endured, but the money that had sustained it was draining away. The sale to the Metropolitan Museum was itself a source of lasting bitterness. The collection that Carnarvon had spent 15 years assembling, that Rothschild money had funded, that represented the 5th Earl's life work outside of Highclere, was broken up and shipped across the Atlantic. The most significant pieces now reside in the Met's Egyptian galleries, where they are seen by millions of visitors who have no idea they were once housed in a Hampshire country house. The Egyptian government, meanwhile, retained ownership of the tomb's contents, and in April 1930, the government provided a grant of £35,000 to Carnarvon's heirs as final settlement, equivalent to roughly £1.9 million today. It was a fraction of what the excavation had cost. The 5th Earl had spent a fortune and died for a discovery whose material rewards went to a museum in New York and a government in Cairo. Highclere got the scraps, the cupboard artifacts, the photographs, and the memory of a man in a tweed suit standing in the desert wearing his lucky bow tie. Meanwhile, Almina had transformed Highclere into something no one expected, a hospital. When the First World War broke out in 1914, she volunteered the castle as a convalescent home for wounded officers. But Almina did not merely offer the building. She ran the operation herself, serving as head nurse, directing a staff of young women who were selected in part for their beauty, and instructed to never appear in the wards without full makeup. Officers arriving at Highclere from the trenches of France were served breakfast in bed and asked which newspaper they wished to read. Alfred de Rothschild, Almina's adoring father, provided the money. The Earl, who was spending most of his time in Egypt, referred to the arrangement sarcastically as Carnarvon, amputate, Highclere. The hospital treated hundreds of wounded men between 1914 and 1918. Bedrooms became surgical theatres. The great staterooms became wards. The medical work was genuine and sometimes harrowing. Bedrooms that had hosted shooting party guests now held men with shattered limbs and shell shock. The drawing room, which Almina had decorated in Rococo Revival style with green French silk curtains funded by Rothschild money, became a recovery ward. Surgical equipment was installed in rooms designed for afternoon tea. The contrast between the opulence of the surroundings and the reality of the injuries must have been surreal for the officers who arrived, many of them from backgrounds that were comfortable, but nothing like Highclere. One patient recalled the unexpected pleasure of being served breakfast in bed and asked which newspaper he wished to begin reading by the Carnarvon butler. Almina operated with the confidence of a woman who had spent her entire adult life commanding servants and spending other people's money, and she applied both skills to the war effort with remarkable effectiveness. Her hospital was not a gesture. It was a fully functioning medical facility that treated hundreds of men and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Letters from grateful soldiers and their families survive in the castle's archives and are on display today. When the need outstripped Highclere's capacity in 1916, Almina opened a second hospital in London, again funded by Rothschild money. After the war, the castle reverted to private use, but the pattern had been set. Highclere was not merely a home. It was a building that repeatedly found itself pressed into service by the crises of the outside world. During the Second World War, the castle housed evacuee children from London, their names still etched into the lead on the roof where they carved them. Allied aircraft from 4 nations crash-landed on the estate during the conflict. The children who were sent to Highclere came from the streets of North London, from families who had never seen a country house and whose lives had been shattered by the Blitz. For these children, Highclere must have been as alien as another planet. 300 rooms in a building larger than most of their schools, surrounded by 1,000 acres of parkland where deer roamed and pheasants startled from the undergrowth. The names they carved into the lead of the roof, a small act of defiance, or simply a child's need to mark their presence, are still visible today. They are the last trace of children who passed through Highclere at the worst moment of the 20th century and then returned to London and vanished into ordinary lives. Allied aircraft from 4 nations, Britain, America, Canada, and others, crash-landed on the estate during the conflict. Sections of a downed B-17 flying fortress are still held in the castle's collection, a reminder that even the 1,000 acres of Capability Brown's parkland were not far enough from the war. The decades after the Second World War were not kind to Highclere. The death duties that had forced Almina to sell the Egyptian collection continued to erode the family's finances with each generational transfer. The 6th Earl died in 1987. The 7th Earl, Henry Herbert, was a quieter figure, best known as the racing manager to Queen Elizabeth II, a position he held from 1969 until his death. The Queen was a frequent visitor to Highclere, and the connection between the royal family and the Carnarvons was one of genuine personal friendship, not mere professional association. The current 8th Earl's godmother was Queen Elizabeth herself. When the 7th Earl died, the Queen lost not just her racing manager, but a trusted friend of over 30 years. The timing of his death, on the 11th of September 2001, meant that the private grief of the Carnarvon family was subsumed into a much larger catastrophe, and the 8th Earl inherited his title on the same day that the world changed irrevocably. He and his father had opened the castle to the public in 1988, driven in part by a discovery that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Robert, the 75-year-old butler who had served the family for decades, mentioned casually to the 7th Earl that there were some items that had been overlooked. Except for the Egyptian stuff, my lord, the Earl, who had believed he knew every nook and cranny of the castle, was led to a set of hidden cupboards and unused rooms where more than 300 ancient Egyptian artifacts had been sitting, undisturbed for over 70 years. Among them was a 3,200-year-old carved wooden face of Amenophis III, the grandfather of Tutankhamun. Scarabs, wood fragments, and a miniature axe head were found stuck to a windowsill. No one knew who had hidden them. The most likely explanation was that the 6th Earl, after his fury over the lost lawsuit and his ban on all mention of Egypt, had ordered the remaining objects concealed. Howard Carter had called them unimportant. The Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves later disagreed, noting that some of the items were the only known objects excavated from the tomb of Amenophis III. They had been sitting in cupboards in a Hampshire country house, while scholars assumed they were lost. The discovery made international headlines. The castle opened to the public for the first time that year, and the queues were enormous. The 7th Earl died on the 11th of September 2001, a date that the family shares with a larger grief. His son George, the 8th Earl, inherited Highclere and found himself custodian of a building that was falling apart. The castle needed an estimated £12 million in repairs. £1.8 million was urgently required to prevent structural deterioration. Ceilings had collapsed. Water damage was extensive. Roughly 50 of the 300 rooms were uninhabitable. The family was not living in the castle. They were living in a cottage on the estate, looking up at the turrets that Charles Barry had designed for the Houses of Parliament architects' greatest domestic commission and watching them crumble. The 8th Earl and his second wife Fiona, the current Countess of Carnarvon, had been trying to generate income from the estate through tourism, weddings, and events. They created the Egyptian exhibition in 2007, converting the old servants' quarters in the cellars into a museum that told the story of the 5th Earl and Howard Carter. The exhibition was successful, but it was not enough. The scale of the deterioration was staggering. The roof, which Barry had designed with such care in the 1840s, was failing in multiple places. Rainwater penetrated the structure and ran down through the upper floors, damaging plasterwork, woodwork, and textiles that had survived since the Victorian era. The upper bedrooms, where Edwardian house parties had once filled every room with guests and their servants, were abandoned, wallpaper peeled from walls, carpets rotted. The infrastructure that Almina had installed, the electricity, the heating, the plumbing, was decades past its useful life. The grounds, 1,000 acres of capability brown parkland, required constant maintenance that the family could barely afford. The follies that Robert Sawyer Herbert had built in the 18th century, Heaven's Gate on Sidown Hill, Jackdaw's Castle, the Temple of Diana with its Ionic columns salvaged from Devonshire House in Piccadilly, were weathering and crumbling. The castle that Rothschild money had saved in 1895, that Rothschild money had turned into a hospital in 1914, that Rothschild money had funded an Egyptian expedition from, was running out of time. The death duties, the maintenance costs, the sheer physical weight of 200 rooms and 1,000 acres of capability brown parkland were too much for a family that no longer had a Rothschild writing checks. The connections between the fictional Crawleys and the real Carnarvons run deeper than most viewers realise. Both families face the crisis of a changing world that threatens to make their way of life obsolete. Both rely on the money of an outsider woman to save the estate. Both turn their home into a hospital during wartime. The fictional butler, Carson, the moral centre of the household, has a real-world counterpart in Robert, the 75-year-old butler whose casual revelation of the hidden Egyptian artifacts was itself a scene worthy of Julian Fellowes. The irony of the servants' quarters being converted into an Egyptian museum was not lost on the production team. The fictional servants of Downton Abbey were filmed at Ealing Studios because the real servants' quarters at Highclere had been given over to the relics of a dead civilization. Upstairs, the Crawleys lived their polished lives. Downstairs, Tutankhamun's grandfather stared out from behind glass. The show's success brought something to Highclere that the castle had not experienced since the days of Almina's Edwardian house parties: crowds. Not aristocratic guests arriving by carriage, but ordinary visitors arriving by car and coach, queuing in the rain, buying postcards in the gift shop, photographing the rooms they had seen on television, and trying to reconcile the fiction with the reality. The reality, as always, was more complicated than the fiction. Julian Fellows gave the Crawleys a happy ending. The Carnarvons are still writing theirs. Then Julian Fellows called. In 2009, the screenwriter and director, who had been a friend of the Carnarvon family for over a decade, asked whether he could use Highclere as the primary filming location for a new period drama he was developing for ETV. The show was called Downton Abbey. The first series aired in 2010. Within 2 years, it had become one of the most watched television programs in the world. 282 million people across more than 200 countries tuned in to watch the fictional Crawley family navigate love, war, and inheritance in a house that was not fictional at all. The parallels between the real Carnarvons and the fictional Crawleys were not coincidental. Julian Fellows knew the history. Lady Cora Crawley, the American heiress whose money saves the estate, was modelled in part on Almina, the Rothschild heiress whose money had done the same thing a century earlier. The wartime hospital storyline drew directly from Almina's transformation of Highclere during the First World War. Even the family dogs were named after the Egyptian connection: Isis and Pharaoh. The show's crew would arrive in February and leave by July each year. The Countess personally coached them on how to handle the furniture. "Take a girl by the arms and a chair by its bottom," she instructed. Certain rooms were padlocked to protect fragile interiors. The servants' quarters downstairs could not be filmed because they had been converted into the Egyptian exhibition. Those scenes were recreated at Ealing Studios in London. The filming fees were reportedly substantial, with some sources citing figures of around £1 million per series, though the exact terms have never been publicly confirmed. But the real value was not in the direct payments, it was in the global visibility that Downton Abbey gave to a castle that most people had never heard of. Before Downton, Highclere was known primarily to Egyptology enthusiasts, racing fans, and the relatively small audience for English heritage tourism. After Downton, it was the most famous house on television. The tourism explosion that followed gave the Carnarvons something they had not had in decades: the money to start fixing their home. The Downton effect was transformative. On a typical summer day, 1,500 visitors now pay to tour the castle. Tickets are booked months in advance. The estate hosts weddings at rates starting at around £22,000. The castle is rented for corporate events, charity galas, and private parties. The annual running costs are estimated at £1.5 million, and for the first time in decades, the income is keeping pace. The Countess has written several best-selling books about the castle's history, including Lady Almina and the Real Downton Abbey, drawing on the archives of letters, photographs, and diaries that the family had accumulated over 3 centuries. The repair program that seemed impossible in 2009 is now underway. Turrets have been restored, interiors have been renovated, rooms that were uninhabitable are being brought back to life. But the fragility of the operation was exposed during the pandemic, when tourism vanished overnight and over 120 staff were furloughed. "We do not have a secret pot of gold," the Countess told ITV's This Morning. "Our pot of gold has been hard work. Post-Brexit staffing shortages have added another layer of difficulty. In 2023, The Earl and Countess attributed their inability to secure sufficient personnel to immigration restrictions, forcing them to suspend large weddings and mothball certain business segments. The castle, that has survived bishops, kings, wars, curses, and death duties, now faces the mundane but existential challenge of finding enough people willing to work in a Hampshire country house for wages that compete with the service industry in nearby Newbury. The castle that has been saved successively by a Rothschild dowry, a butler's memory, and a television show is still, in the end, dependent on the willingness of strangers to pay £20 to walk through rooms where Van Dycks hang on walls that were crumbling a decade ago. Today, visitors to Highclere Castle enter through the great entrance hall that George Gilbert Scott designed in the 1870s, past the red and blue marble columns, and find themselves in the saloon, the heart of the house, with its 17th century Spanish leather wall coverings and its sense of being the centre of a world that no longer exists. They walk through the library where the 4th Earl plotted colonial policy with Disraeli. They see the music room with Napoleon's desk. They climb the oak staircase that took a year to carve, and then they descend into the cellars, through a tunnel designed to evoke the atmosphere of an Egyptian tomb, and find themselves face to face with the artifacts that the 5th Earl brought home from the desert, and that his son hid in cupboards because he could not bear to be reminded of what Egypt had cost them. The 3,200-year-old face of Amenephis III looks out from behind glass, surrounded by scarabs and fragments, and the photographs that Lord Carnarvon took between 1907 and 1914, images of a man in a three-piece tweed suit standing in the searing Egyptian sun, wearing the same lucky bow tie he wore every day of his adult life, digging for something he was not sure existed, and finding the most famous tomb in the history of the world. And the question that hangs over all of it is the same question that hangs over every property in this series. Who does this place belong to? To the Bishops of Winchester, who held the land for 800 years before a Protestant king took it from them. To Robert Sawyer, the Attorney General who bought it with the profits of a legal career spent serving the Crown. To Capability Brown, who reshaped the landscape into an idealised vision of England that had never existed in nature. To Charles Barry, who spent 40 years transforming a modest manor into a palace and died before the interiors were finished. To the 4th Earl, who used the library to plan the expansion of an empire that would subjugate millions. To the 5th Earl, who married a woman for her father's money, crashed a car that nearly killed him, went to Egypt because his lungs could not survive an English winter, and stumbled into immortality because a water boy tripped on a step. To Almina, the pocket Venus, the illegitimate Rothschild daughter who bought her way into the aristocracy and then spent her fortune nursing wounded soldiers and funding the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. To Howard Carter, who had no money, no degree, no title, and no patron until a Rothschild heiress's husband agreed to fund one more season. To the 6th Earl, who was so angry about Egypt that he hid 300 artifacts in cupboards and banned the word from his household. To the 75-year-old butler who remembered where they were. To Julian Fellows, who turned a crumbling Hampshire castle into the most famous house on television. To the 282 million people who watched Downton Abbey and who now queue for months to walk through rooms that were uninhabitable 15 years ago, or to no one at all. Perhaps a house this large belongs to whoever needs it most at any given moment. The bishops needed it for God. The earls needed it for status. Almina needed it for love, or something that looked enough like love to serve the purpose. The 5th Earl needed it as a base from which to dig up someone else's dead. The 8th Earl needs it as a business, and the visitors need it as a fantasy, a place where the past is beautiful and the servants are invisible and the curse is romantic rather than clinical, and nobody mentions the mosquito bite or the death duties or the cottage on the estate where the Earl lives when the tourists come. Every generation has used Highclere for something different. Every generation has called it home. And every generation has discovered sooner or later that a house with 300 rooms is not a home at all. It is an obligation, a performance, a trap, made of bath stone and Spanish leather, and the unspoken understanding that beauty on this scale always costs more than it is worth. The 5th Earl knew this. He left Highclere every winter for the Egyptian desert, preferring the company of the dead to the company of his own inheritance. He found his wonderful things 3,000 miles from the house he was born in, and then he died in a hotel room in Cairo, killed by an insect and a razor, while the castle waited for him in Hampshire, magnificent and empty, and already beginning to fall apart. His grave on Beacon Hill, in the earthworks of an Iron Age fort that was ancient when the Romans arrived, looks down on the castle's turrets across a valley of grass and cedar trees. It is one of the simplest graves in Hampshire. A headstone on the lawn, a fence, no gold, no lapis lazuli, no 3,000-year-old death mask, just a man who went looking for a pharaoh and found him and lost everything else. The castle below survived him. It survived his son's fury and his widow's debts and 2 world wars and 8 decades of decay. It survived because an illegitimate daughter married an earl, because a butler remembered a cupboard, because a television writer needed a house, and because 500 million people around the world decided that this particular pile of bath stone and Victorian ambition was worth caring about. Whether they were right is a question that every visitor answers differently. Standing in the saloon with the Spanish leather on the walls and the weight of 300 rooms pressing down from above, wondering what it costs to keep something this beautiful alive, and who, in the end, is willing to pay.